he might actually open a second front deliberately against NATO, these wars don't stop, they just move to different phases. When you have such a large war on your doorstep, these things are just unfortunately going to happen. If you get a ceasefire within Ukraine, the Russian threat to NATO territory increases. And what Ukraine are doing at the moment, they're really hurting the Russians, and not just the Russian military, but the Russian economy. These incidents have actually happened a number of times since 2022. About 3 years ago, there was a similar event that actually went into Poland and killed 2 farmers. So very, very similar event. You've had some incidents in Romania as well. And the issue is, it's the problem of the largest interstate war in Europe since the Second World War happening on your border. And there's a variety of ways this might happen. The missiles can just go off course, and the Russian missiles are not great in terms of their accuracy. Then there can be interceptors, so Ukraine tries to take down a Russian missile, and then those interceptors can go over the border as well. So there's a variety of ways that this can happen. The issue is that each time this happens, it kind of, it shows that some of the NATO assets are working as they should, but also that there are still some gaps. Certainly when you look at the sort of trajectories, whether that is ordered at the top level, we still don't know. But I think what you can say with certainty is, in terms of the risk profile, Putin and the Russians are not worried about things straying over into the NATO, onto NATO territory at the moment. Because actually, from a NATO perspective, it's pretty difficult to work out how to respond to that. Now, in some ways it's good, because then it forces NATO to get together, as they will do today, to discuss the incident. And it's always useful when these things happen, because it gives NATO the ability to talk through what may happen within the future. But there's no suggestion to think that this is deliberate from the point of that there'd then be further Russian aggression onto NATO territory. And ultimately for NATO and Europeans and the US, the issue is, well, what can you do about it, apart from just keep trying to protect your own airspace? There's already a huge rounds of sanctions, against the Russians. Yes, you can dial it up a little bit, but that's pretty much all you can do. In response, you can't really punish the Russians very well for doing this type of activity. There's no suggestion that NATO would necessarily then do offensive operations against the Russians in a sort of tit-for-tat manner. It would have to be far more deliberate than what we are currently seeing. So it's something that the Russians kind of know this and play on that fact. So whether it's deliberate or not, again, I don't think that that's the point. The issue is that they're just not concerned about it at all, as the Russians have not really been concerned about potentially hitting European targets, for example, within Kyiv, like British Council buildings or EU facilities there, because again of the risk appetite from the Russians. It's just they do not worry about the collateral damage, etc., in the same way. And I think it's also worth noting, as we're talking about basically a missile that's hit Poland in the middle of a field, not really caused any damage, at the same time that 9 people were killed in Ukraine, 48 injured, and that is part of a huge massive strikes across Europe. So I think there was also a deterrence point here, where NATO, when this happens, they can't be really alarmed. They've got to do the usual things, but it just looks a little silly when NATO, the world's strongest military alliance, as it's always referred to, is complained and outraged because one missile hits a field, whereas the Ukrainians, almost 500 attacks per day of a variety of natures of drones and missiles. That's significant, and it makes NATO look a little bit silly in terms of their response to this sometimes. And again, when these things happen, it does sort of highlight the gaps, and also, NATO has done a very good job of actually taking down a variety of incoming drones and missiles over the years, and the Ukrainians as well are trying to prevent that. With a lot of assets that the Europeans have been provided, but it just pushes to this sort of the central argument that there's not actually that much that NATO can do in the military sphere against that. You get the usual sort of politically, so Russian ambassadors, etc., will be called in. We'll have a strongly worded statement, etc. There might be an issue on sanctions or other, but there's no suggestion that NATO is then going to take more offensive action. It has to actually move more to the defensive. Like I say, each time that this happens, it shows where the potential gaps are. You can start to sort of maneuver sort of defences around, but it is just one of those things for frontline states, which it's basically Romania and Poland mainly. There is an element, in the Baltic states as well. But when you have such a large war on your doorstep, these things are just unfortunately going to happen. I think we could do more to protect Ukraine. Like I said, at the start, I mean, the fundamental position this week is no one's died from NATO country. A lot of people have died from Ukraine. Politically, we are very committed to the defense of Ukraine and helping. We could do more in that regard. In terms of our own territory, I mean, politically, the declaration is that NATO will defend every inch of NATO territory, but that is, from a large-scale Russian incursion. We'll still continue to do a lot in terms of this, and the hope is in the next couple of years, as NATO air defence coverage gets better, not to sort of the Cold War levels, but sort of to try and bridge that gap, that these things may just happen less and less. And actually, the critical part of this is to protect civilian installations, but also military installations, because one of the largest military logistics hubs now is actually in Poland, because that's the main logistics hub to get Western supplies within to Ukraine. So it's really vital to protect those types of installations. Now, if Russia was to deliberately attack those installations and missiles hit, main logistics hubs, I mean, that would be an attack on NATO territory, and that would probably again change the calculus in terms of NATO's Article 4, NATO's Article 5. But again, I'm optimistic in some regards, because when a missile incident like this happens, it allows NATO to discuss potential options in the future on live scenarios, not hypotheticals. Okay, well, this has happened, fine, no one has died, but what happens next time? What is the response? So actually, it's healthy for NATO to have these types of incidents every now and again, because it pushes NATO into better reactions. Again, it's a prioritization level. You can't protect everywhere, so NATO, as a collective organization, and then also the nations individually within that, need to prioritize what to protect. And the issue for a lot of the frontline states who are directly on the border, it's like, okay, well, what do you protect? Because the issue with the Russians is that they will target everything. They will target civilian infrastructure, they will target hospitals, they'll target schools, because again, they have done this week within Ukraine. So if you have limited air defense capabilities at the moment, which are growing, it's okay, well, what actually do you protect? Military installations really important to continue to support Ukraine, but it is splitting the effort, which NATO nations are just not really used to these types of trade-offs, because NATO, while fighting, for example, in Afghanistan, you only need to protect the military installations. You need to protect your forces in Afghanistan. You didn't really have to think about everything at home, and that's the fundamental change now. And it also makes it far more political in terms of national capitals, but also within NATO, because every time that these things happen, or Romania is targeted, then it's a bit reactive, and we're starting to move things around. But the amount of money now that NATO militaries are spending, I mean, it is really significant, and a lot of that is in air defense capabilities. And they will just grow, and these gaps will start to sort of be plugged, but it will take a little bit of time. I mean, my assessment is that the Russians and Putin knows that they've struggled militarily in Ukraine. The thought of being able to militarily defeat NATO is just really silly. So if the Russians want to go, or basically test NATO and test Article 5 and show that it's, or try and expose it's hollow, it'll be a limited operation. We're not talking about the Russians wanting to get armor into Berlin or Paris. It's going to be localized to probably somewhere within the Baltics. So if it is a smaller specific operation, the question is, well, can the Europeans, especially potentially Europeans on their own with minimal US support, deal with that? Well, actually, probably yes. And that's what they're focused in on now, and making sure that they're able to deter that. But I think that's more on it's less a sort of military capability question. It's more a political will question of, if the situation arises where suddenly NATO has to be more forceful against the Russians, ultimately will those orders be given, or can the Russians sort of do what they have done in a variety of ways over the last couple of decades and just, effectively push their luck and try and win that way? I think the first point is, we're not talking about an end to the war. The war will continue. What you're talking about is effectively moving the war to the next phase, in the hope that there will be, at least in the short term, a ceasefire, because the Russians need to, Russians and the Ukrainians they're exhausted. They need to recapitalize. But, there is just a view that the Russians will go again at some point in time. So really, it's only a respite. So I think if you do manage to get to a ceasefire, NATO's role within this is actually to continue to increase their support for Ukraine. And what Ukraine are doing at the moment, they're really hurting the Russians, and not just the Russian military, but the Russian economy, Russian political sort of centers of gravity. And they're doing that, generally speaking, on their own, with some support as well. And that is effectively, the whole objective of that is to pressure Putin just to get to the negotiating table, so you can maybe get a ceasefire. So, war's end discussions are very, very far away, but this is to start that dialogue. The issue for NATO is that slightly perverse logic that actually, if you get a ceasefire within Ukraine, the Russian threat to NATO territory increases, because it effectively allows the Russians to focus more on NATO than, for example, Ukraine. So they will recapitalize their forces. At the moment, they can't really threaten NATO territory, only in a very limited way. So this is where NATO has to be quite sort of sensible about how they manage that, and make sure that all of the money that NATO's spending on their militaries is put into areas which will yield the highest results quickly, to make sure that potential Russian threat against NATO territory doesn't materialize. Because it would allow the Russians the breathing space to recapitalize their forces and potentially push against a NATO territory. There is a view that, from a Putin point of view, he doesn't think that Ukraine should exist as a country. He sees it as Russian. All of the things that he's said over the years. So the thought of losing to Ukraine is pretty difficult for Putin. But could he lose to NATO, fighting alongside Ukraine potentially? So there's a view that he might actually open a second front deliberately against NATO if it looks like he is losing, because then he loses to NATO, the greatest, the world's greatest military alliance, not just Ukraine, who he believes doesn't have a right to exist. Because neither side have got their achieved their political objectives. Putin wants to subjugate Ukraine, nowhere near to that because of Ukraine's resistance, but he has absorbed 4 oblasts, regions of Ukraine, into Russian territory. And for the Ukrainians, they want to be a sovereign state, which they still are, but they want sovereignty over all of their territory. So they're fighting back for their territory, which they haven't achieved at the moment. So, for example, if you did get a ceasefire this year, I mean, it is possible, but there'd need to be a sort of a change in Putin's calculus, which, as we talked about, that's what the sort of Ukrainian military strategy is at the moment. But if it's a ceasefire on the current lines, then Ukraine wants to get back its territory and Russia wants more territory. So those objectives are still extant, but neither can achieve them because of that. And you see this in other areas. South Korea, for example, after the Korean War, going back to the early 50s, in the Middle East as well, these wars don't stop, they just move to different phases. And, there is a view again with, the ultimately Putin's, objectives have not changed since 22 and actually probably since 2014. That there is a view that he will just basically try and go again at some point in the future, or even if it's not Putin as the Russian president, the person who may take over for him would potentially do the same. The only challenges that Putin's had internally really over the last couple of years have all come from the right of him rather than the left. Those people who argue that he's actually not going hard enough in Ukraine, that he should mobilize more, that's just the position they're in. So that's why I just don't think we're talking about an end to the war. We're talking about a ceasefire and the move to a next phase in the war.